Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and today we're going to talk about someone that a lot of people don't know about. I actually lived when some of this took place, and I had no idea that this went on. But before we get into it, make sure you're liking, subscribing, and sharing this with everybody you know who likes true crime and all of these kinds of creepy stories. So make sure you're tuning in every week. We release a new episode every Wednesday early in the morning. So thanks for tuning in, guys. And today, the person we're talking about, now we've talked about Jim Jones. Jim Jones was a pretty bad dude. He had a pretty gnarly cult following that he ended up basically killing off over 900 people in that cult with a mass suicide. This person, Jim Jones had nothing on this person. This individual, built her own cult following, and it's thought that she has killed over 3,000 people, murdered them. Not a mass suicide, murdered. And we're actually going back to Uganda, where our favorite dictator, Idi Amin, has just been overthrown. And we're going to try and talk about how his actions actually influenced the life of Credonia Mwerinde. That is who we're talking about today. And you're probably saying to yourself, I have never heard that name before. This person is just as mysterious as Jack the Ripper. We know who she is, but we don't know a ton about her. We know what she did, but we don't know a lot about her. And the thing is, guys, she's still alive somewhere. She could even hear this podcast at some point. Who knows? But let's dive into her life, at least what we know about it, and the horrible things she did that made her a horrible human in history. Like I said, we don't really know a ton about Credonia Mwerinde's past. So we do know that she was born in 1952, and we don't really know a lot about where she came from or a lot about her upbringing, how she was raised, like what she did as a child. We don't really know hardly anything about that, actually. And if you look her up and you pull up her Wikipedia page, and I don't get my sources from Wikipedia, just so you know, but I looked it up because one of the sources had mentioned that it's like 2 paragraphs worth of information about her. Not a lot about her younger years. But we do know she came from Uganda and was impacted by Idi Amin and his reign of terror. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, because it kind of impacts her a little bit later in life. It wasn't so much when she was younger. It was more later in her culty days. So we'll talk about that in a second. But we do know that in her younger years, she was known for her beauty. She was very, very charming, very intelligent, and could be very manipulative. And she used her beauty for her advantage, of course. She came across as very gentle and very pleasing to everyone around her. She had 3 brothers and actually married a man named Eric Mazima. And he said about her, this is what he said about his ex-wife. They got divorced at some point. Again, her past is super blurry and super hard to dismantle, I guess. But her ex-husband said that she was never as happy as she was making money. Credonia loved money. She loved wealth. She absolutely loved earning money and having money. So in her 20s, she was actually broke, flat out broke. So she convinced her husband, Eric Mazima, to give up his second wife, which, by the way, was more common in that area to have multiple wives. So she forced him to give up his second wife, and she forced him to sell his land so that they could open up a bar. She wanted to own her own bar so they could start earning money that way. So she worked the bar, she became a bartender, and eventually became a prostitute to make even more money. I don't know if she was prostituting while she was married to Eric or if it happened after the fact. It's just known that that's what she was doing on the side to make more money. And it was well known throughout the town that Credonia had a very hot temper. Like, she got angry super quick and could be very violent and would go off in an instant and get very violent. To add to that, one of her favorite weapons of choice when she did become violent was fire. She liked fire a lot, and that will become very important later on in her story. But once she got so upset with a Uganda health official who had actually come to their bar to inspect it and make sure everything was kosher and good to go, and he had had some issues. And because she was so mad that he had had issues with their establishment, she actually ended up burning his house down. She found out where he lived, tracked him down, and burned his entire house down. Now, after this incident happened, I am going to give her family some pretty good credit, because after she burned this man's house to the ground, her family was like, ooh, she's got some mental problems and needs some help. She is mentally ill and we need to get her some help because this is not normal behavior. So they actually sent her away to get treatment to help her deal with her anger, deal with her violent tendencies. And obviously, spoiler alert, this did not work. It did not help. But again, that is things to come. So one of her friends even claimed that Credonia had seduced a man who was just passing through the village and actually killed him and stole his wallet and stole all of his money. And this murder supposedly happened at the bar after the bar had been closed and all the patrons had left. Supposedly, she had murdered this man. And the next morning, there are actually quite a few patrons that claimed that when they came in the next morning, they saw her cleaning blood off of the concrete. So it wasn't just a friend claiming that this happened. There were a couple witnesses to her cleaning up afterwards. It's also believed that Credonia actually killed off her 3 brothers one at a time because they all died one by one, leaving her as the sole person that was going to inherit all of her father's land, all of his inheritance, all of it. And they were all younger when they died. So everyone believed that she had poisoned each one individually. And it was actually her father's land that she inherited, where she would eventually establish her cult and create the cult's compound. So after being open for about 10 years, her bar would close in 1889 and they would be flat out broke. And she went downhill pretty fast, obviously, because she needed money. She wanted something to keep her sustained. Well, soon after the bar closed, Credonia claimed that she had been wandering inside of a cave and the Virgin Mary had appeared to her. I mean, why not? You're why not? You're in a cave. Why not have the Virgin Mary appear to you? And this would actually be the beginning of her cult. Is this vision she had of the Virgin Mary. Now, after this vision, she actually converted to Roman Catholicism. And at first, she seemed to be making huge changes in her life to shift and match her new standards in her new religion. People were actually super impressed because she went from being a prostitute and bartending and drinking and everything to being very celibate and very focused in her religion. She often would spend hours praying and writing, and she chose to sleep without a mattress to, shun any, comforts, modern day comforts or whatever. So she chose to sleep without a mattress, and she decided that she would never smile. Now, I wasn't aware that Roman Catholics weren't allowed to smile. I have a lot of friends that were Roman Catholics, and they smiled quite a bit. So I don't I don't fully know why she decided that from that point forward, she would not smile. I think it's interesting that she chose to do this because, I know you can smile in the Roman Catholic Church. But it's an interesting decision, and I even saw some of her pictures, and she genuinely, no smiles. She was scary. That stern face was very scary. So soon she would actually start, she was so committed to her religion and so deep into her religion that soon she actually started blacking out during just normal conversations with people. And she started receiving messages from the Virgin Mary for those individuals while she was talking to them. So she would just be standing there talking and just black out and wouldn't be responding to the person she was talking to because she was busy receiving revelation from the Virgin Mary for that individual. And this actually inspired a lot of people because she had made such a drastic change in her life that actually a lot of people started comparing her to Mary Magdalene, thinking that she was proof that it doesn't matter how low one's life was, it could truly be changed through religion. And because of her previous life, it really inspired a lot of people. And it inspired two men specifically who were actually really well known in the area as religious leaders. She was able to recruit two very predominant clerics to join her in creating this basically new religion. And their names were Dominic Katari. Remember that name. I'll mention it eventually later. So Dominic Katari Babo is his name. Forgot his last name. And he was actually an excommunicated priest. And then Joseph Juboter, I think I'm saying his name wrong, Joseph Juboter. I tried to actually include pronunciations in my notes this time. It's not helping, guys. I'm sorry. I'm doing my best. Anyways, he was a devout Catholic. So we had Dominic, who was excommunicated priest, and Joseph, who was a devout Catholic. Now, Joseph was, you'll hear me talk about him a little more because he was slightly more involved in this, but Joseph was actually obsessed with visionaries, obsessed with people who claimed to have seen visions, who he just was obsessed with anyone who could have visions. And he himself has claimed that he had visions back in 1984. So anyone who made claims that they had had a vision, especially of the Virgin Mary, he was all in. So Credonia even told him that one of her visions was specific for him because she saw a vision where the Virgin Mary had appeared near his home and said that there was a man named Joseph Juboter who would help her restore the 10 Commandments. Now, I didn't know that the 10 Commandments had been lost or had gone away or anything like that, but apparently they needed to be restored. So, I mean, good for them. Want to bring that back. That was great. But when he heard this vision that Credonia had had about him helping her restore this church, he was stoked. Like, he was so excited. And from that point forward, he was on Credonia's side. He would do anything and everything to help Credonia and play a huge role in the creation of this cult, to the point where a lot of people thought he was the actual leader. And he was a figurehead, which, again, we'll talk about later. I keep jumping ahead of myself. But Credonia was the backbone and the leader of this cult. And in 1989, this cult was formed, and it was thought to be a religion at first, obviously, but it was for sure a cult. And it was called the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. So they started establishing this church, and at first it fell in line pretty easily with the Roman Catholic Church, but the longer they established it, the more their teachings kind of drifted away from the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And they actually started preaching in the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God that the year 2000 was when the world would come to an end. That was the end of the world. And for some of you that lived through that, a lot of people believed that the year 2000 would be the end of the year, or end of the year. It was obviously the end of the year, but the end of the world. If you lived through that, you know there was quite a few people that believed that. It wasn't, obviously, in 2024. It obviously was not. But they preached this pretty heavily, that the world would be destroyed in the year 2000. And because Joseph was actually a really well-known figure in the community, it actually gave them an automatic following and an automatic boost to the membership of Credonia's new church, because a lot of people trusted him. He was an outstanding member of the community, always happy and kind to everyone around them. And so their church immediately got a giant boost. And at this time, Credonia was actually living in Joseph's home with a few of his other family members. And her and his family did not get along. They did not like each other. They actually all, they seem to hate her, not just, dislike her strongly. No, hate is the word that is used. And it's probably due to the fact that they all believed that Credonia and Joseph were actually having an affair, and his wife was living with him at this time. So under her own roof, her husband was having an affair with this other woman. So it's no shocker that people didn't like her, because she claimed to have repented of her ways, but then she was doing this kind of thing. And the family finally had enough with her when she actually beat up Joseph's wife and then burned a bunch of her stuff. See, he loves the fire. She loves fire. But she actually beat her up and burned all of her stuff. And that is when the family was like, enough. We have had enough. We wash our hands of you. Get out of our house. So at that point in time, Credonia went and lived in their compound. So, like I had mentioned, the land that she got inherited from her father, she created a religious compound for the movement of the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. So she went and lived there. Now, in 1991, soon after she left, Joseph left his family to go live with Credonia in the compound for their cult. And this is when he actually became the figurehead of the cult, and made it appear as if he was the one leading and he was the one giving all the directions. But behind the scenes, it was all Credonia. She was the one running the show. She was the one receiving the revelation and the visions. And Joseph, because he was a man and could have more influence at that time because women didn't have as much influence, especially in that area of the world, he was able to quote unquote lead the church, even though it was all Credonia. Now, she turned Joseph into a crazed follower. Like, he started getting pretty crazy. Like, she had him wearing priest robes and he was the only one allowed to ordain any men into their priesthood. And it's believed that she was actually using Joseph for his money and because of his manhood, because women couldn't do any of those things. So it seems as if Credonia didn't actually repent of all of her evil ways. She was still manipulating. She was still using men for their money, still really liked her money, and loved to influence people. So their teachings started to really twist versions of the Roman Catholic Church, and they focused very heavily on the 10 Commandments and preached of Christ. But again, they also believed the world was going to end in the year 2000. So their movement actually became really popular in the late 80s. And this is when our friend Idi Amin has an influence on this, because the late 1980s, early 90s was a very troubled time in the Uganda history. Like, this is right after the rule of Idi Amin, who we have talked about. If you haven't listened to that episode, you should go do it so you know the fear and trauma that these people had experienced with the rule of Idi Amin. So everyone in the nation was still reeling from his reign. And right after he was deposed, the instability that swept across Uganda was insane. It created a civil war all throughout the country. And a lot of people were actually suffering through the AIDS epidemic at this time as well. So people were desperate to find any kind of meaning, any kind of healing, anything that would help them recover from Idi Amin, from civil war, and from AIDS that was just sweeping through their nation. Unfortunately for some of these people looking for solace and peace and help, unfortunately they found the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments, because that is not what this was. That is what they were led to believe it would be. But because of the trauma throughout all of Uganda, it pushed a lot of people towards this cult. And in my research, apparently there were quite a few different cults in Uganda. This one was probably the worst one. But the size of the group actually got up to be around 4,000 people. So it was a pretty hefty group. And that group also included children. Now, Credonia, she was not the figurehead. That was all Joseph. But she became known as the programmer to people because everybody knew that Credonia was the one pulling the strings. They knew she was the one that was actually running the show. And I find it interesting that they called her the programmer, because this is in like the late 1980s and early 1990s. Computers were not a big thing back then. Like, programming was still pretty new, pretty fresh. Like, it wasn't a huge thing. That's a pretty typical term nowadays, programmer. But back then, that didn't exist. So I just think it's really interesting that that would be the phrase that they chose for someone who was running the show and manipulating things and making things run exactly how they wanted it to. So Credonia taught that salvation could only be found through the Virgin Mary's messages that she herself was receiving. So people had to follow whatever she was saying if they wanted redemption, because it would only come through the Virgin Mary's messages that she was getting. no other way. Now, like I said, 2000, the year 2000 is when the world was supposed to end. So, doomsday was for sure supposed to be December 31st, 1999. She said that the Virgin Mary had shown her that famine would sweep across the land. There would be wars everywhere, so much that there would be rivers running with blood and food would turn to poison. That is what she was telling her followers, and all of them believed it. Everyone just believed what she said. That's the one thing that I don't understand about cults is maybe I'm just a really resistant personality, but I never believe anything that anyone says unless I can find proof for myself. That's just the kind of person I am. So when someone tells me this is exactly what's going to happen, I'd be like, well, okay, well, show me some receipts. I want to see, like, how is this actually happening? But people just believed her and was like, okay, if that's what's going to happen, we better repent. And she told everyone the only way to survive all of this chaos and death that was coming was to repent. And the only way to repent was to listen to her because she was receiving messages from the Virgin Mary. Now, their cult was actually very self-sustaining. They would plant their own food. They actually used all the skills from all of the people who joined the cult to keep things running and keep people fed and those kinds of things. Now, when I say keep people fed, that's a very, very, very loose term of what it means to keep people fed. And we are going to touch on that in just a second. But part of their compound is, and I do want to mention, they started because they started growing so big. They had multiple compounds around Uganda, scattered all over the place. They were all over. So they had a lot of different compounds because their congregation had grown so big. But their main compound was the one that was on her father's old property. So anyways, every so often they would actually make a pilgrimage to a rock that was shaped like the Virgin Mary. Now, they had to climb a mountain to get up to this rock. They would hike this pretty steep hill to get there. And when they would arrive, they would have worship sessions and pray and everything. So that was a pretty common occurrence in the compound. And to join the cult, as you do with any cult, you have to give up everything that you own. So you would give all of your money to the church and sell all of your property, sell everything that you owned and give it over to the church. And then you would go and live in one of the compounds with the rest of the followers. That is how you joined. They would go to the point of even stripping of their new members of all of their clothing and require them to wear the cult's specific uniform. They all had to wear these same clothing and lose literally everything that they owned. That is how you joined this cult. Every morning, all the followers would be woken up at 3 a.m. and they would be required to pray for 2 whole hours. 2 hours of prayer. I'm not going to lie. If I was required to do that, I would probably pretend to be praying and just sleep because 3 a.m. for prayers, that's nuts. And they had to fast 2 days out of the week. And the other days, they were given very meager amounts of food. So this is what I'm talking about when I say they kept their people, and I'm doing air quotes, you can't see, fed. They didn't. Like, it was really bad. 2 days out of the week, they were not allowed to eat food. And then the other days when they actually could eat food, they weren't given enough to even sustain their normal activity and hard work that they were doing. It was so bad that children in the compound would actually try and catch bugs to eat them because they were starving. They wanted more food. Well, if a child got caught eating any bugs or trying to catch bugs to eat them, they would be severely punished for this behavior, even though they were starving. They were all starving to death. Now, the kids were also, on top of starving, they were infested with all kinds of diseases. But they couldn't complain. They didn't dare complain because they were so afraid of the repercussions of doing so. So they just kept going on like life was totally normal, even though they'd have sores and blisters and all kinds of pain. They never complained. And the children weren't even really allowed to attend school outside of the compound. They weren't allowed to interact with each other. And when the parents joined the cult, besides just giving up all of their property, they were sworn to a life of poverty and chastity. So they had to give up all of their stuff and be okay living in poverty. And they had to promise that they would be chaste. Even with their spouse, they weren't allowed to do anything. They were often forced to sleep on bare floors, like Credonia had chosen to do when she first converted. No mattresses, no nothing, just bare floor. When they did actually have the opportunity to bathe, the followers were forced to use laundry soap. And not just any laundry soap, horse laundry soap, to bathe themselves. And it was so rough it would cause blisters and sores to form on people's skin. And the one part, I believe they did this for complete control of their citizens, was they forbade anyone from speaking one to another. Nobody could talk. And I guess if you force your followers to not be able to talk, they can't complain about you or question what you're doing, right? And if you even wanted to talk to a leader in this cult, so all the leaders would wear black garb, like black, what is the word? I can see the picture in my mind. Like, think of like nun gowns or priest gowns and those kinds of things. That's what they wore. They were all black. And if you tried to even talk to anyone wearing all black, you were in big, 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 big trouble. So they actually kind of started their own form of sign language since they weren't allowed to communicate with each other. The followers started to use their own kind of sign language to communicate a little bit. But again, they weren't allowed to speak. So there was no complaints, no questioning, nothing. Now, Credonia controlled the cult with fear. Obviously. Obviously. Like, she punished children for eating bugs. But the fear that she used most was the fear of the devil. The evil, evil devil. She said anything from the outside world would contain evil and evil spirits and needed to be exorcised, so they would take possession of anything from the outside world. She also claimed that the devil was everywhere and that the devil would come after them and attack them. And so people were so afraid of doing anything wrong or the outside world because the devil was there and they would be in danger because he is there. She would take her followers on punishment trips to raid any of their relatives that didn't join the cult. So basically, they would all get up together and go find the houses of the relatives and beat them or burn down their houses or do things to quote unquote punish them for not joining the cult. I mean, what a great group activity. Let's go burn down our relatives' homes. Sounds like fun. So, and I think it's ironic after talking about making them fear the devil. Like, you're burning down and threatening people. Like, what are you doing? Burning down houses. Anyways. So, she often actually used poison as a way to kill anyone that she deemed to be her enemy. So you could be Credonia's friend or be a member of the cult, but if she deemed you an enemy in any way, shape, or form, she would just kill you with poison. And she was ruthless. She had no sympathy, no compassion at all. Like, you messed around, you found out real quick by being dead with poison. So she was known as being super ruthless, and the day of the apocalypse was actually quickly approaching. And I mean, that's at least what the members thought. They would sell all of their remaining possessions and give all of the money to the leaders of the church because it was getting close. It was crunch time. So they knew, well, I'm not going to need this, so I'm just going to get rid of all of it now. Give all of my things to the leaders because they know what that we need to do. This will be a sign that I'm repenting, whatnot. Well, the day came, December 31st, 1999. I was there. I can tell you, the apocalypse didn't happen. It was an uneventful day. It was a pretty uneventful day. But this shocked and confused all of the members of Credonia's church. I mean, I would say I would be shocked and confused if I thought the world was supposed to come to an end and, oh, look, it didn't. But she also told them, I said it was coming in the year 2000. By the end of 2000, the world will come to an end. But the next day after the 31st, trouble started brewing among the members because her prediction didn't come true. Credonia's credibility with her visions with the Mother Mary was instantaneously shattered for most of the people in her cult. And they were starting to ask a lot of questions of her and the leadership and demanding the return of their money and property. They were not happy. And all of them were like, well, okay, the world didn't end, so I need my stuff back to survive. And they started really questioning the legitimacy of all of their leaders. And they demanded that the leaders find a way to fix this because they had predicted the world should have ended and it didn't. So they needed to fix it. Well, they fixed it, but not in the way I think these members were hoping. So on March 17th, so a few months later, in the year 2000, 500 people, mostly women and children, got up, bathed, shaved their heads of all their hair, trimmed their nails, made themselves as clean as possible, put on their nicest uniforms, and then burned all their belongings. Why would they do this, you may say? Why on March 17th? Because Credonia had summoned them all to the Ark, quote unquote Ark. That is what they called their church, is the Ark. She had claimed that this was going to be the day, this is when it was going to happen. So make sure you're looking your best and you're ready to go. So they burned all their stuff. They got ready to go. So Credonia shuffled them all inside the Ark. And when they got inside, the people noticed something very odd. There were 68 jerry cans. If you don't know what a jerry can is, it's like a gas can that's bigger. You would definitely recognize it. They use them a lot on like military cars and those kinds of things. So jerry cans are bigger gas cans. 68 of them lined all the walls of the church. So why is there gas in here? Well, once all 500 people were inside, they nailed the door shut and the window shut. And by they, I mean the leaders of the church. So Credonia and all of her little henchmen that were leading the church. They nailed everything shut and then lit the church on fire. It's said that the fire got so hot that people's heads literally exploded, like popped because the pressure and heat was so great. It just, oh, blah, blah, blah. It's gross to think about. And no one was able to escape from that church building. 500 people. Like I said, Credonia liked fire. She really liked fire. And she killed 500 people with it. Now, after they lit the fire, what did Credonia and her accomplices do? Well, obviously they fled. They ran. They ran away. Now, there is a story that before this happened, when everyone started questioning Credonia about the legitimacy of her prophecies and her actual connection with the Virgin Mary, people started to want to leave. And there's a story that Credonia actually stopped a public bus, got on, and scanned every single face looking for her members. And when she would find them, she would pull them off the bus and force them to come back. And there was a citizen that remembered when she had done this, and they just were like, her gaze was terrifying. I didn't even know what was going on. But thankfully, there were no members on that particular bus. So she was making sure every single one of her followers, they were all loose ends. She was going to tie up the loose ends. So before she had burned this church down, she made sure she found all of her followers, even the ones that were trying to defect and get away from her. And once they lit that fire, her and her accomplices bounced. They were gone. And police actually arrived pretty soon after the fire had started because the neighbors of the compound started seeing the smoke and they started smelling a really foul smell coming from the compound. So they were concerned, obviously. So they informed the police that something was going on. They didn't know what was happening, but something strange was going on over there. So the police got there and they found the 500 charred bodies that were so burnt that there was absolutely no way to identify any of the victims. They were just ash because the fire had gone so hot. With 68 cans of gasoline, that is not surprising. Now, they originally believed, the police, that the members had committed a mass suicide, like the people in Jonestown. Everybody knew about Jonestown, so this was something that they also believed had happened, was the members had all gotten together and committed mass suicide. That is, until they noticed another foul smell. Besides charred bodies and gasoline, they smelled something else. Rot. They smelled rot coming from a latrine off to the side. When they went to investigate the latrine, they found the bodies of 6 large men partially dissolved in sulfuric acid. 5 of them had been killed with poison, and 1 had been killed with a blow to the head. This is when the police went, maybe this wasn't suicide. So they started an investigation and launched an investigation of all the compounds that Credonia and her church, I use that in a very, very, very loose term, had owned. And after opening their full investigation, they started coming across mass graves filled with hundreds of people across all the multiple compounds that the cult had owned. Authorities were mystified. They were so confused over how Credonia could have managed to keep killing so many people a secret. Like, it was mind-blowing because there were so many people and so many mass graves And they had compounds across all of Uganda, and no one noticed. It was a giant secret. So they were mystified on how they were able to keep this a secret. Now, remember the name Dominique? We talked about him, Mr. Babos. So at his house, they found 155 bodies discovered, actually buried in his house. And even more were found outside under crops that had been planted. Now, these mass graves, I will tell you, the graves were dug by the people inside the graves. They didn't know that they were digging their own graves. Credonia had received inspiration, and if they heard that, the Mother Mary wanted them to dig trenches that day, that is what they did. And they didn't know that they were digging their own graves. Half of the victims that were found were children. Most of them were poisoned, but if they did not die quickly of the poison or quietly, they were strangled, stabbed, and or beaten to death. So Credonia was, like I said, pretty brutal in her enforcement, and she was trying to tie off all the loose ends. All of the people in these mass graves were found naked, stacked on top of each other in the pits that they dug themselves. The police believed that 6 men, those 6 men that they found in the acid, were actually the executioner for all the other mass graves that they had found. And they actually didn't have enough money to continue the investigation, so they don't know if they have found all the mass graves or not. The ones that they have found, they don't know if that's it or if there's more. But those 6 men, they believe, were the ones who actually went and killed all of these people. And then when they came back, Credonia finished them off because they were at the final loose end. So it's just, she is so manipulative and so good at getting people to do what she wants them to do, and then has no qualms with just killing all of these people. Now, there's a quote that I have from Peter, guys, I'm going to butcher his last name, Asibihubiwi. I'll spell it for you. You can try and figure it out. His name's Peter, Asibihibwe. He was 17, and he was actually one of the few people that actually survived this, because the morning of the fire, he had actually snuck out early. He snuck out of the compound because he was looking for sugarcane because he was super hungry. So he escaped being burned in that fire because he was looking for sugarcane. And what he said about the prediction that the world was going to end in the year 2000 is, he said, all she said was that there would be no year 2001. And I guess her prediction technically came true for those people that she was telling that to, because she took it upon herself to end all of their lives. In total, they believe the death toll is somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 victims. Again, they have no way to truly know how many victims there are because they didn't have enough money to continue the investigation or time. So there could still be mass graves out there, but they believe it's around 3,000 people. And we compare this to Jim Jones, and both are tragedies. But Jim Jones, manipulated his people into taking their own lives. And some, we know, he forced the poison into their bodies. But Credonia literally killed all of these people. She had them all executed, or she put them to death herself. 3,000 people. This is the biggest mass killing of a cult ever. And how many of you have heard of this? Like, I had never heard of this. And on March 17th, Credonia and all of her leaders fled from the scene of the crime. And guess what? None of them have been found. No one knows where they are. They're all still alive somewhere. It's believed they're all alive, living life with the money they took from all of those people that they murdered. Like, my mind is blown. And there is very little about her on the internet. And she's still out there somewhere. It's just... And the next craziest part, besides the fact that her and her accomplices got away and are probably living a great life right now, is if the police, had not found those 6 men in the acid, they would have believed that this whole thing was a mass suicide and they would have only found those 500 people. They would have never known that all of those people had actually been killed. And they would have never had found the mass murders. Or the mass murders. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. It was a mass murder, but the mass graves. And the investigator, Eric Nigambi? There we go. Oh, I got it. Eric Nigambi said that this would have been the perfect murder if they had not found those 6 men. They would have just assumed everyone in the religion killed themselves. And Asuman man, I'm telling you, these are rough names. Mugeni? Mugeni? I even listened to these, I swear. He said, there are many more graves. We know that. We tried, but there isn't much interest and there is no money when talking about trying to further the investigation of what happened. We tried, but there isn't much interest. Heartbreaking, and there is no money. That's just so sad to me that all of these people died, and there just seems to be no care to finish discovering the total number of people that Credonia killed. Like, mind-blowing. So, if you have never heard of Credonia Mwerinde, you now know her story, and you now know that she was worse than Jim Jones, manipulative, abusive, and murdered so many people. And that is why Credonia Mwerinde is our horrible human in history today. Now, stay tuned for next week. This one is going to be a good one as well. This was actually a listener request. Again, shout out to Sam. We are going to be talking about King Leopold II of Belgium. You know the phrase, crimes against humanity? That was first used because of him. So, we are going to talk about him and his life and rule from 1865 to 1909. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good one. Make sure you guys are liking, subscribing, and sharing this with anyone you know who likes these creepy stories. We are going to see you guys next week. Bye.